So, I just finished this class with Daniel Schrag, and the title of the class is called Confronting Climate Change, a Foundation in Science, Technology, and Policy. Dan Schrag is one of the most renowned lecturers here at Harvard, and he teaches at both the Harvard Kennedy School and the School of Science. His background is actually in geological sciences, but he sort of expanded from that background into climate change and into the policy aspects around climate change at the School of Government. And what I found very interesting about this course, myself coming from a science background, was the basis of the class on science. We went through the geological history of the world, of the Earth from the Paleocene period up until the Eocene period. There's certain geological terms they have for how the Earth has sort of changed over the time period. And we sort of studied as to the current status of the climate of the world, in the sense that what we're seeing in terms of increasing climate temperatures across the world, is this something that is normal? Given the history of the world, are we meant to be seeing higher temperatures? And in going through the science of the Earth's climate, one thing we found out in class was that the Earth is in the period of an ice age. So every couple thousands years, you have a situation where it goes from what's known as a thermal minimum, or the lowest temperatures it can ever reach, to a thermal maximum. That's when it gets warm. And we're currently in what is known as a thermal minimum. So essentially, we're meant to be going down to the minimum temperatures across the world, and we're in an ice age period. And this frequency of this ice age changes from time to time, but it's become much more frequent over a geological time span. I think, long story short, what we're seeing in terms of an increase in temperature across the world is not geologically expected. We expect it to be actually seeing temperatures going down, but because of what mankind has done, now it's called the age of man, or the Anthropocene. Man has been able to bring about changes across the climate by exuding CO2 into the atmosphere. The CO2 creates a blanket, essentially traps heat, and leads to temperatures rising across the world. We looked at the impact of this rising temperatures across the world. We see that it leads to situations where hurricanes become much more aggressive and much more common, because temperatures of the surface oceans over which high-speed winds pass increase, and this in turn increases the energy contained within the hurricanes. We looked at the fact that because of higher temperatures, we have a lot of drying out of debris across forest areas and grasslands, and this in turn leads to much more intense and frequent wildfires. We looked at the situation of sea level rise. So the Antarctica and the northern part of the world, known as the Arctic, has some of the largest concentration of ice in the world. And what we're seeing is that because of higher surface ocean temperatures, this is actually causing the Antarctica ice shelves to begin to break off. And once that break off has happened, it means like a cock in the stopper, you cannot stop it. And so once you have a lot of those ice shelves melting into the oceans, it raises the sea levels and potentially can actually wash away many of the industrial metropolitan areas where many humans are currently conglomerated. You can think about New York, you can think about Lagos in Africa. A lot of big cities are actually on the ocean. So climate change does in fact lead to a number of potential serious issues that we sort of addressed in the class. And then once we're done with the science and the potential implications, we went on to explore the technology. How do we address the issues around climate change? And some of the technologies we looked at was solar, was wind, was electric vehicles for transportation. We also looked at areas around heat pumps, electric cook stoves within the homes. And overall, the kind of thinking around the application of the technology was, what can we do to minimize CO2 emissions, because CO2 emissions is actually what is driving a lot of the climate change we're seeing. And in order to minimize CO2 emissions, we need to technologically apply all the solutions into areas where we're seeing the most CO2 emissions. A lot of these areas that we looked at applying technology is actually tied to where we're seeing a lot of CO2 emissions. So transportation is one big area. So the idea here is you want to electrify all the sectors that are having the highest emissions. And so by electrifying this, you can now apply the technology. So for example, transportation is one of the areas where there's a lot of CO2 emissions. And part of dealing with that issue is through electric vehicles, electric scooters, in-home appliance usages, especially the source of electricity for that. So many countries use coal, they use gas, natural gas to power in-home electricity. And so part of the way to deal with that issue is to electrify the grid, move from using coal and natural gas to using hydro, wind, solar, and even nuclear as energy sources for powering electricity. Within the homes themselves, you want to move out from using natural gas cookers to using electric cook stoves. In developing countries, you want to move people out of charcoal into using clean cook stoves or intermediate types of applications like compressed natural gas or liquefied natural gas as cooking options before completely moving them into clean electric cook stoves. Other areas that see very high usages of also emissions of CO2 include the industrial areas where you're heavy industry making steel, aluminium, and there's a lot of coal being used to fire some of these hot furnaces. Unfortunately, there's not good clean technologies that can be applied right now to many of these areas, and so the solution here is that maybe perhaps many of these dirty industries might still have to continue to operate as they currently are, but what could happen is that they could then use what is known as carbon capture technologies to remove whatever CO2 has been spewed from these industrial processes into the atmosphere. Within the homes, especially in this part of the world where it gets very cold and people are using gas to heat, potentially moving to electric heat pumps as a way to heat the homes versus using gas. So some of the ways in which we thought about how to solve the CO2 emission problem. And then after this exploration, we looked at the policy. What sort of policies should we as leaders be encouraging our countries and our people to do? And so part of this policy is, at least from the US perspective, is really thinking through how to enable more building happen, especially when it comes to the building of transmission lines that can take energy generated from wind and solar grids into homes across the American landscape. Internationally, on the other hand, policies actually might be tied to enabling countries actually who have fossil fuels to be able to begin to blend those fossil fuels with cleaner sources of energy and potentially transmit completely into clean sources of energy. And we looked at some policies that might be focused, for example, on punishing polluters, using carbon taxes, or policies that can be focused on rebates, so encouraging people to move on to clean energy sources by giving them money to make that move. In the US, it seems that the focus has been on using those rebates or as industrial policy to get people to use cleaner energy sources. And then lastly, we considered communication, the means of encouraging people through a non-antagonistic means, but really making them see themselves as part of the solution to the problem so that we can bring them on board to try to address these issues. So all in, it's been a very insightful class. For me going forward, I'm really thinking about my own personal role to try to leave a better earth, a cleaner earth to my children and grandchildren. And I'm looking at it as an economic opportunity. All these technologies that are available for implementation. In what ways can I support my government to lead to its implementation and use in the developing South, and even support its use as well in the global North? I don't know. What are your thoughts? What do you think about climate change?